Before I begin this episode, I would like to take this moment to pay respect to recently deceased actor and champion weightlifter David Prowse. This man was responsible for bringing Darth Vader in the original trilogy off the page. While James Earl Jones provided the voice and Sebastian Shaw was the face of Vader when his helmet was removed at the end of the trilogy, David was the man inside the suit and continued to control what the now iconic villain would do on camera throughout the rest of the trilogy. As if 2020 hasn't already claimed the life of many other great actors, David died at the age of 85 after a 2-week hospital battle with coronavirus. As someone who will be remembered not just as the man behind the mask of Darth Vader, but as a kind man who loved his fans as much as they loved him, may the Force be with him as he rests in peace. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Luke Carruthers, and welcome to another episode of Escaping Through the Lens. Today we bring a closure to the ongoing Star Wars discussion so I can actually talk about films and TV series of your recommendation. First thing I would like to say is I apologise for this episode being late. Last week I was caught up in getting work done for my course, and if that wasn't bad enough, the internet at the accommodation I'm staying at went down for nearly 2 days, and I was getting ready to come home to my family for Christmas. Now that that's all sorted, I'm ready to talk to you guys about the Star Wars sequel trilogy. So, after Revenge of the Sith in 2005, there weren't really any more major Star Wars films released for a long time. There was the Clone Wars movie based on the show of the same name, but aside from that, not much else. It wasn't until 2012 when Disney bought the rights to Star Wars from the company Lucasfilm for $4 billion. As if they weren't making enough money from Pixar and Marvel, but that's a discussion for another day. And began production of what we now know to be the Star Wars sequel trilogy, starting with The Force Awakens in 2015, The Last Jedi in 2017, and The Rise of Skywalker in 2019. In terms of their reception, I don't think I've ever seen a series of films more divisive in all my 3 years of studying media. A collective few loved these films, while a collective few also despised them. There seemed to be no in-between with these films. As for me, these are the Star Wars films I have the most memories with. As mentioned in my first podcast episode, the first time I went to see Force Awakens was only after I'd watched the original trilogy for the very first time with my dad, my sister and my best friend Matty. Next, I saw The Last Jedi twice, once with my new friends I had just made in my first year of college in 2017, shout out to Tim, Joe and Laura if you're listening in, and a second time with my dad and my sister. Then I saw Rise of Skywalker with Matty and my sister after she had gotten us free tickets seeing as she works at our local cinema. So admittedly, I have a bit of a bias with these films, but I won't let that get in the way of my criticism because in all honesty, they're better than the prequels, which honestly isn't exactly difficult, but they're not as good as the original trilogy, save for one which I'll wait until I get to discussing it. For now, let's begin with Episode 7, The Force Awakens. Also spoiler warning as always.
There's been an awakening. Have you felt it?
Yes.
There's something more. The droid we seek is aboard the Millennium Falcon. In the hands of your father, Han Solo.
It's been about 30 years since the events of The Return of the Jedi, both in terms of the timeline and quite literally. The Empire is long gone, and Vader's body was burnt after Anakin Skywalker came back and gave up his life to save his son from the Emperor. However, from the ashes of the Empire rises the First Order, led by the sinister Kylo Ren. Both they and the Resistance, led by General Leia Organa, fight for their galaxy whilst also searching for anything that can lead them to Luke Skywalker, who has vanished to parts unknown. The Resistance so they can recruit him to fight, and the First Order so there are no more Jedi in the universe. Resistance fighter Poe Dameron goes to the desert planet Jakku to retrieve a map that leads to where Luke Skywalker is hiding, but is captured and interrogated by Kylo Ren and the First Order, but not before he stores the map data inside his droid BB-8, who escapes into the desert. Poe escapes the First Order fleet with help from a stormtrooper FN-2187, who Poe decides to call Finn, but their TIE fighter is shot down and crashes on Jakku, with Finn escaping the crash and Poe being presumed dead. All the while, BB-8 has been provided shelter from a desert orphan, Rey, who gets her food by trading in parts from crashed Star Destroyers and AT-AT walkers buried in the sand. The two meet up with Finn after BB-8 recognises him wearing Poe's jacket, and the two escape an airstrike from the First Order in the Millennium Falcon, which has been stored away near a scrap trade. They bump into Han Solo and Chewbacca along their escape, and so it's up to them to get the map to the Resistance after Finn lies about being part of them, escape the might of the First Order, and figure out a plan to take down their brand new weapon, Starkiller Base, which is basically the Death Star, only the size of an entire planet, and could destroy multiple planets at once this time. This story isn't amazing, and if you paid close attention, contains a lot of very similar story beats to A New Hope. You know, a desert orphan finds a droid with top-secret info and escapes an evil Empire force inside the Falcon before planning with the Resistance to destroy a weapon base that can annihilate planets. I mean, not that the series isn't known for repeating itself, but one can argue that Episode 7 is a straight-up carbon copy of Episode 4. I sort of disagree in that, yes, there are not-so-subtle similarities, but I think there's enough differences to help it stand apart as its own story. As time has passed, it's easy to be less forgiving of this copy-and-paste method of story writing, but think about the time that the film was released. This didn't just have to be a structurally good Star Wars film, but this had to live up to decades of long-time fan expectations, make up for the reception of the prequels, introduce a new generation of fans to the series, and justify Disney even buying Lucasfilm in the first place. The pressure was on around that time, and given how critical half the fans can be when it comes to Star Wars, I don't blame them for playing it safe, even if a few more risks could have been taken. I think what's most important about this story is that it knows what people come to a Star Wars film for, and shows it. There's no political talks, no pod racing, no midichlorians, no racial stereotypes, no lovey-dovey talks about sand, just space battles with lasers and laser swords, and world building, with worlds that actually look like they're really there, by the way. The first positive with this film is that it knows not to take itself too seriously. In fact, compared to the previous films, this is much funnier, which might throw some fans off, but I actually enjoy it. What makes the comedy work is that it never takes away from the darker or emotional moments, making sure that while the destruction of multiple planets and lost lives of those in the war in between the Resistance and the First Order is to be taken seriously, the characters feel more alive than ever with the sprinkling of comedy into the mix, and comes off way more natural sounding than the prequels and even the original trilogy on some occasions, if not without its moments of cringe like this.
Ray, you're a pilot. You can fly anywhere. Why go back? You got a family? Got a boyfriend? Cute boyfriend?
None of your business, that's why.
Speaking of Finn, he is a very well done new addition to the Star Wars universe in this film. A conflicted stormtrooper turned to the good side is a great concept. It not only gives him a sense of doing the right thing, but opens up the idea of the rest of the stormtroopers being enslaved to do their horrible work. Suddenly, these once basic soldiers from the Empire who you couldn't really read emotions from given that their faces were hidden by their helmets, suddenly have a deeper side to them, making us care for them more, and making us as an audience hate the cruel First Order even more. What's also great with Finn is that him being a treacherous stormtrooper isn't his only character trait. He's someone who can act overly confident in himself when he lies about being in the Resistance, and while he has an understandable reason to want to escape the war, he still stands up to fight, applying back to his desire to do what's right when he left the First Order in the first place.
Why are you helping me? Because it's the right thing to do.
Which applies with his friendship with Poe and Rey. He relates to Poe's hot-headed enthusiasm to save the galaxy, but also relates to Rey wanting to find the purpose in their lives. Speaking of which, I should probably talk about those two. There isn't much to talk about with Poe, as he essentially takes the Han Solo type role, being the witty, hotshot pilot who takes risks to save the day, only without the constant complaining, which I prefer. That scene where he and BB-8 reunite after BB-8 thought he was dead was also so precious. As for Rey, she's probably the most divisive character in these already divisive films. Is she an awesome addition to the Star Wars universe with her own characteristics, or is she the Mary Sue with nothing else to her? Personally, I'm of the former side of this debate. While similarities between her and Luke from A New Hope are noticeable, with them being desert orphans who go on an epic adventure and learn how to use the Force, They have enough in their lives and personality that make them differ. Luke longs for adventure but is stuck on a moisture farm with his aunt and uncle, so while he is in a serviceable home, it's not what he wants his whole life to be around. When he runs to Obi-Wan before the Empire kill his aunt and uncle, he suddenly has no desire to stay home, and looks to help Obi-Wan on his quest to save the princess and take down the Empire whilst learning to use the Force. Rey has no safe or proper home and no family to live with, yet continues to stay there in the hope that one day they will come back for her. If Luke was in her situation, he would have bailed the moment he sees a chance to travel the galaxy. But not Rey. Even when she, Finn and BB-8 escape Jakku to get to the Resistance and Han offers her a job of travelling with him and Chewie, she still wants to go back home. Then, when the Force calls out to her from Luke/Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, stored away in a castle owned by Maz Kanata on the planet Takodana, and shows her a brief nightmare vision of what happened in the past preceding The Force Awakens, she is scared of the Force and runs away wanting to go home to Jakku, only for her to be captured by Kylo Ren. Ren then interrogates her using the Force, which he eventually makes her mind snap and realise her parents are never coming back. So instead of pushing away the Force, she starts to accept it just as Luke did, which allows her to survive her interrogation, mind control the Stormtrooper to give her a chance to escape, and even use it later on in battle with Kylo Ren using the traditional relying on instinct of the Force we know from Episode 4, which she is only able to do as well as she does against Kylo because he got shot in the chest by Chewbacca after he killed Han Solo. I mean, true, her abilities as an ace mechanic and good pilot aren't exactly explained, but I'd like to think of that as spending many years exploring ships for selling parts as a means to survive being how she understands about ships, thus how to fly them. I mean, you don't just pick out random parts of a ship without knowing they'll be worth a lot. As for the other characters, Han is his usual grumpy, witty self, but with a sense of maturity, which is nice. Leia is the same caring battle general that we know and love, but obviously with her age she can't be out on the front lines anymore, so keeps stationed at the Resistance base, and the rest of the good guys, Chewie, C-3PO and the eventually woken up R2-D2, are the same as they've ever been. As for the dark side, we've got Captain Phasma, the cool-looking commander of the Stormtroopers, who is sadly wasted towards the end of the film before she can show off her skills. Supreme Leader Snoke, who is only shown through a dark hologram as the menacing being who turned Kylo to the dark side in the first place, and General Hux, who gives a fantastic evil speech to the First Order moments before Starkiller Base destroys the planets of what's left of the Republic, if being a little similar to another speech from a certain dictator.
Today is the end of the Republic. The end of a regime that acquiesces to disorder. At this very moment, in a system far from here, the new Republic lies to the galaxy, while secretly supporting the treachery of the loathsome Resistance. This fierce machine which you have built, upon which we stand, will bring an end to the Senate, to their cherished fleet. All remaining systems will bow to the First Order, and will remember this as the last day of the Republic!
Still not sure? Let me play that clip in German.
Heute erleben wir das Ende der Republik. Das Ende eines Regimes, das stillschweigend die Unordnung toleriert. In diesem bedeutenden Moment, in einem System weit von hier entfernt, ist die neue Republik dabei, Lügen in der Galaxis zu verbreiten, während sie im Geheimen den verräterischen, abscheulichen Widerstand unterstützt. Diese furchterregende Maschine, welche ihr erbaut habt, auf der wir festen Fußes stehen, wird dem Senat ein Ende setzen, ihrer hochgeschätzten Flotte. Alle übrigen Systeme werden auf die Knie fallen vor der Ersten Ordnung und sich an diesen besonderen Tag erinnern, als den letzten Tag der Republik.
Now do you see what I mean? But without a doubt, the best character introduced in this film is the big bad himself, Kylo Ren. Being the son of Han Solo and Leia, he was a student at the Academy... Well, let me scroll down so I can read that paragraph more. Being the son of Han Solo and Leia, he was a student at the academy set up by Luke who wanted to train the next generation of Jedi. However, he was turned to the dark side by Snoke, along with other students from Luke Academy, becoming the Knights of Ren. While we only ever see Kylo, or Ben Solo as his real name, his presence is no less intimidating, but at the same time, because he doesn't always wear the helmet, when we see his face we can tell he isn't fully converted to the dark side, as he is torn between his power over the First Order and his family. It's a very complex villain not really seen in the Star Wars films, especially compared to the prequels. My negatives with this film aren't really as big as the positives, but are what ultimately hold this film back from being fantastic. There's the sometimes cringe dialogue, Rey's unexplained pilot skills and striking similarities to A New Hope that I mentioned earlier, but there's also the final act of the film, which is only okay in my books. While I'm glad I can actually follow what's going on, and I'm watching characters I care about, the trench run to destroy Starkiller Base still feels way too familiar to destroying both Death Stars in the original trilogy, if still visually stunning, and the lightsaber duel feels slightly unearned. I can't exactly explain why, but something just doesn't feel as engaging with this fight between Rey and Kylo compared to the original trilogy lightsaber fights, and even Anakin vs Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith. It's still cool to see, especially the fact that they're fighting on an exploding planet, but that's essentially it. Cool, but sort of ineffective. Oh, and before anyone else mentions it, Leia giving Rey a hug instead of Chewie after Han Solo dies is the worst part of this film, when she barely knows her, but has known Chewie for years. All in all, my thoughts on this film could be summed up with that scene of BB-8 using a lighter as a thumbs up. It's great. It's not the best, and at times copies way too much from the previous films, but given the pressure it was under back when it first came out, I still very much enjoy it every time I watch it. I put it slap bang in the middle of the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy. Not the best, but far from the worst. Alright, time to bring up the divisive subject back up again as I talk about the most loved and most hated of the sequels, Episode 8, The Last Jedi.
How's your wound?
It's nothing.
The mighty Kylo Ren. When I found you, I saw what all masters live to see. Raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special. The potential of your bloodline. A new Vader. Now, I fear I was mistaken.
I've given everything I have to you. To the dark side.
Take that ridiculous thing off.
This, surprisingly, takes place right after the events of The Force Awakens, as opposed to a few years or so. After the destruction of Starkiller Base, the First Order, in both an act of revenge and to wipe out the Resistance once and for all, track down their base and arrive for an assault, with a rather reckless plan of fighting back led by Poe that, while it results in a First Order dreadnought ship being taken out, also results in the deaths of quite a lot of Resistance fighters, they're able to escape. Or so they think. Turns out the First Order has a device that can track them through light speed, which leads them to an unprepared attack, putting General Leia in a coma. So with plans made by Maz Kanata, Poe, Finn and newcomer Rose, she and Finn are to travel out to the planet Canto Bight to find a code breaker that can shut down the First Order's device under the radar of both them and the stand-in Admiral of the Resistance, Holdo, who insists on outrunning the First Order out of light speed without properly giving away her plan for some reason. All the while, Rey is trying to convince Luke to come help the Resistance and teach her about the Force, whilst suddenly starting to have long-distance conversations with Kylo Ren via some strange Force connection. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a film that is both loved and hated. Only thing is, when I say people hated it, I mean they really hated it. So much so that this unfortunately had a drastic effect on Episode 9, which I'll save for when I get to it. Where do I stand on this? Well, I'm on the side of the fans that actually loves this film. But not just as the best of the sequels, because man oh man, if you've been following this ongoing Star Wars discussion, you'll know that I'm no stranger to differing opinions, which I still stand by. But allow me to ask you this. Does anybody else think that The Last Jedi is as good as Empire Strikes Back? Yeah, because that's where I stand. It's not better than Empire Strikes Back, and even then, if you remember, Empire Strikes Back was my least favourite of the original trilogy, so The Last Jedi is still far from my favourite. But I still enjoy this film, a lot. They're both as good as each other. So why is this? Firstly, I have to get this positive out of the way before anything else so I don't keep falling back onto it. But The Last Jedi is visually the best looking Star Wars film. The Force Awakens helped set the basis for what could be done in a Star Wars film with modern filming technology, and as a result, the cinematography is gorgeous. The dynamic camera angles, the choice of colours, the lighting, the exposure. This is what I call a proper looking and sounding film. The perfect blend of real life sets and visual effects. Not every bit of CGI is perfect, admittedly, and on occasion can be kind of distracting, but nowhere near the levels of Attack of the Clones, and the rest of it looks just too good for me to even care. My absolute favourite shot being Holdo's lightspeed kamikaze against the First Order to let the Resistance get away. The tension rises as the First Order start to kill off the escape pods one by one, as Holdo prepares to jump to light speed as the ship turns around with the First Order suspecting nothing. But right when they discover what she's doing and have a chance to react, everything goes silent as her ship makes the jump. We only see the outlines of Snoke's ship and the Star Destroyers as a bright white light slices them in half in an instant. We cut to see the brilliant explosion from a distance, and what breaks the sound is a shattering boom of what sounds like an F1 car breaking the sound barrier. That might be my favourite scene in anything Star Wars. Another favourite thing I have with this film is how it tries to create the idea of balance, which comes from Rey's training with Luke. Ultimately, she is set to learn how to access the Force from the light side, yet in her first session, she senses both the light and dark side, and as much as she is insisted upon by Luke to stay in the light, she is tempted into searching the darker side, which she almost loses herself in before coming to her senses, in which Luke is scared by her sudden strength in the Force. During her time on the island, she starts to connect to Kylo across the galaxy as they start to share a bond.
Why did you hate your father? Give me an honest answer. You had a father who loved you. He gave a damn about you.
I didn't hate him.
Then why?
Why what? Why what? Say it.
Why did you kill him? I don't understand.
No. Your parents threw you away like garbage.
They didn't.
They did. But you can't stop needing them. It's your greatest weakness. Looking for them everywhere. In Han Solo. Now in Skywalker.
With Rey bringing him closer to the light, adding on to the conflict within him established in the last film, despite Luke being against her trying to reach out to Kylo. So we have flawed perspectives of the Force. Luke is right in wanting Rey to stay in the light side, but is wrong in not accepting the surprising connection she and Kylo share, and being overcome with grief, guilt, and cutting himself off from the Force. Kylo is right for reaching out to Rey, but is wrong for where he stands under the control of Snoke, whilst also being in command of the First Order, and killing his own father in the last film. Therefore, Rey is neither right nor wrong for seeking advice from the two of them. Even if their minds being linked turns out to be a trap set up by Snoke, it's still showing that maybe things with the Force aren't so black and white, and even then, there's still a small hint towards the end that suggests that maybe they still have the connection. This also applies to the Resistance and the First Order. When Finn and Rose escape Canto Bight with a different codebreaker because they couldn't quite reach the one they were looking for, the codebreaker DJ reveals that his job used to be selling weapons to the First Order and the Resistance, telling us that while weapons dealers make deals with the evil empires, they also make deals with the heroic rebellion, so both sides have done bad deeds in order to fight for what they believe in, which makes sense if you think about it. In the previous films, with how many bases were set up only to be destroyed, how many ships were built only to be destroyed, and how many weapons they have access to only to, you guessed it, be destroyed, you can't help but wonder where do these weapons and supplies keep coming from? Again, creating the not so black and white perspective of the war going on. Speaking of the Resistance, not only do we feel a sense of danger this time around with them trying to outrun the First Order out of light speed, but we're given a reason to actually care for them. In the original films, the rebels I feel were only seen as people that exist only to die to the attack of the Empire, We're never really given any time to know them as people, which one could argue there isn't time to get to know them in the heat of escape and battle, which gave more time to develop our main characters, but I believe came at the expense of not feeling properly invested in the people they are fighting alongside. In the opening fight, we're shown a lone gunner, Paige, that after her teammates are taken down, sacrifices herself to take down a dreadnought, and is later revealed to be the sister of a newcomer, Rose Tico, who has only ever worked in maintenance but decides to accompany Finn and BB-8 on their mission to find the Codebreaker with the desire to not only honour her sister, but also do her part in fighting off the First Order that she has hated ever since she was a child. This is how you get me invested in the other guys on the front lines. In fact, while we're talking about Rose, I know that scene with her towards the end of the film is what people dislike about her character, which I'll save for when I get to the negatives, but I really don't think she deserves the hate she gets for what she represents with the Resistance. What I mean by that is, shortly after the film came out, fans who didn't like the character harassed the actor Kelly Marie Tran on Instagram until she had had enough and left the social media site entirely. Guys, if you don't like how a character is written, don't give the actors a hard time because they're not in control of what they do and say in the film. They're just there to do their job. It's the writers and directors. But even then, harassing someone for their creative choices or doing their job, forcing them to cut themselves off from social media, that's disgusting. It's completely despicable. Furthermore, I think the idea of being able to track the Resistance through lightspeed adds a sense of tension that the previous films kind of missed out on. That being the fact that escaping the Empire, while they were narrow escapes, were not as tense as they could be, as it was just a matter of jump to light speed, or as I call it, press this button to get away from the bad guys. Because suddenly the First Order are now an even more unstoppable force, and leave the Resistance even more barely able to escape their pursuit, to a point where at the end of the film, the group is small enough to fit aboard the Millennium Falcon as they're practically on their last legs while they escape. I'd go on more about my favourite parts of this film, but then I'd leave no time for me to talk about the negatives or the next film. So I'll list them. Rey and Kylo teaming up to fight Snoke's guards, Luke using all of his life force meditating to create a projection of himself to distract Kylo Ren, giving the Resistance time to escape, Ghost Yoda giving a pep talk to Luke, the opening fight of the film that is full of the right amount of comedy, tension and emotion, Rey's training with Luke, General Hux constantly trying to be a better leader than Kylo but knowing not to mess with him, and every scene with Kylo Ren. Alright, now for the negatives, which compared to The Force Awakens, there is a lot more of. I'll get the worst one out of the way. Holdo not telling anyone her plan is dumb. I get that she and Leia want to knock Poe down a peg given his recklessness and not taking orders that led to the death of some of the Resistance fighters, but all she has to say is that they're trying to reach a secret base, which she doesn't say, causing everyone on board thinking they're going to die and leading Poe to start a temporary mutiny. The whole side quest scene on Canto Bight, trying to feel sorry for space horses and trying to bring in social commentary on capitalism, while a harmless attempt at trying to connect Star Wars to a larger theme and world building, is never mentioned again and as a result feels a bit forced. Snoke's death before we can even get so much as a backstory feels like a bit of a waste, but saying that though, the Emperor wasn't given any backstory until the prequels, so it doesn't bother me too much. Leia being able to suddenly use the Force and fly through space, the scene where Captain Phasma comes back only to be wasted again, and Luke being grumpy, unoptimistic and mean towards Rey, while a striking character change that I think works, I also imagine might have been too risky of a writing move to do for the fans who know and love Luke's character from the older films. However, I still love this film more than Force Awakens despite those problems. This film has some lower lows compared to The Force Awakens, but the highs it reaches are so good that I almost don't care because of how much I'm enjoying myself. Keyword being almost, which is exactly how I feel about Empire Strikes Back, hence why I think they're both as good as each other. I expect a lot of you won't agree, and that's absolutely fine guys, but I'm writing this out of my experience with these films and not everyone else's, and my time watching The Last Jedi was very fun. If you're one of those people that say Rian Johnson ruined my childhood, I don't think you're taking the whole point of different directors into perspective. This man can direct films, he can direct great films, and loves the idea of subverting audience expectations. Give him the keys to directing a Star Wars film, a series where if it doesn't go a certain way, a majority of the fanbase gets angry, the risk of subverted expectations becomes a double-ended sword. As mentioned before with Kelly Marie Tran, if you don't like how something is done, fair criticism is alright, but please, don't harass people for doing their job. Well, now with that done and dusted, let's move on to the final film in the mainline saga, Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker.
Snoke,
trained you well.
I killed Snoke. I'll kill you.
My boy, I made Snoke. I have been every voice you have ever heard inside your head. The First Order was just the beginning. I will give you so much more.
You'll die first.
I have died before. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
It's not exactly clear how long it's been since Episode 8. An echoing transmission reveals that the Emperor has returned. Not wanting to lose his authority over the universe, Kylo Ren travels to Exegol, the world of the Sith, where Palpatine is seen to be a rotting body clinging on to life. He promises Kylo a huge fleet of Star Destroyers he calls the Final Order, each with the power to destroy planets, but only if Kylo kills Rey. Meanwhile, the Resistance has gotten more recruits and learned via a spy in the First Order of Palpatine's return and the Final Order. Rey deduces from the books of the ancient Jedi texts that she got from Luke's hidden isolation planet that the best way to destroy the Emperor is to find the way to Exegol. With Finn, Poe, BB-8 and C-3PO, they venture out to find how to get there whilst also trying to escape Kylo, the First Order, and the now revealed Knights of Ren. Does that sound like an engaging story? That is ultimately a shame, because right off the bat I have to state this. For what is built up as not just the conclusion of the sequels but the Skywalker saga in its entirety, this has to be the most mediocre Star Wars film I've ever seen. It's not god-awful, but it's not fantastic either. The biggest problem, I think, comes from how this film retcons The Last Jedi. For those of you that don't know, a retcon is when a series rewrites a previous story or established history to tell a different one. The retcon, I believe, was only put into place because of the reception The Last Jedi got. Basically, after fans began to sulk about the film they were given, Disney panicked and basically tried to undo all of what The Last Jedi established, as well as bringing back director J.J. Abrams from Force Awakens to scramble together an Episode 9 script, when originally Colin Trevorrow was meant to be writing it. Retcons such as the Resistance being on its last legs only to get a load of recruits in time not established, Rey's parents supposedly being no one who sold her off for drinking money, now one of them was a Palpatine who wanted to save her, Snoke being his own person was now created by Palpatine who's been pulling the strings since the beginning, Rose was established as a regular and is now sidelined, which I think was done for the actress to avoid getting any more harassment. And the amount of retcons just goes on and on and on and on and on that I'll just spare you the details of and move on to other parts of the film. In terms of characters, this film has the problem of trying to do interesting things with them, but are ultimately changed later on. C-3PO, for example, is tasked with translating Sith writing from a dagger to locate the Wayfinder, which is a key to getting to Exegol. But in order to do that, he needs to have his memory wiped. This would have not only been a more impactful scene had he been surrounded by the friends that he's known for years rather than people he barely knows, but would have impacted more if R2-D2 didn't restore his memory later on.
Memory restoration complete.
Speaking of the two Wayfinders, they are stated as a key for people to travel through this portal to the world of the Sith, so when Kylo Ren crushes the second one before Rey can take it, we're left thinking that there's no other way to get there until Kylo just lets Rey take the other one in his TIE fighter. Then the Resistance can apparently track Rey through the portal to get to Exegol, and even then, when Kylo comes back to the light side after a pep talk with Ghost Han, Ben is able to travel without needing the Wayfinder or tracking Rey, as are spaceships of people across the galaxy led by Lando Calrissian. Like, do people need the Wayfinder or not? By the way, Lando is barely in this film. He shows up out of nowhere, gives directions to the Sith Dagger, a moment which feels strikingly similar to the finale of Avengers Endgame, with the heroes presumed about to die before a huge fleet of backup arrives at the last minute. Back on topic of characters, Finn and Poe are both sidelined while at the same time given some sort of development. I swear, they're so mixed. Poe, for example, used to be a spice runner on the planet they go to translate the Sith coding on, and bump into some supposed old friend of Poe named Zori, but that doesn't really go anywhere. Finn, I feel like he was sidelined the worst in this situation, gone from being a reliable asset to the team to just someone who calls out to Rey when she's in danger.
Right! Right, come on! I can't leave her! We can't! Right!
They try to give him a scene with Janna, another stormtrooper turned rebel, but it's just stated as something that they have in common, like, that's it. General Hux is revealed to be the spy and helps Finn, Poe, and once presumed dead Chewbacca, which Hux's reasoning is clear for him being the spy, is because he wants to see Kylo Ren lose, but it feels like they're just giving him a reason to be in the spotlight before, spoilers, he dies to Admiral Pride, who supposedly served the Emperor in the days of the Empire? Were these characters rushed, or were bits cut out of this film that went more into detail around them? I won't be critical on what they did with Leia, seeing as Carrie Fisher unfortunately passed away shortly after filming The Last Jedi, so they had to rely on deleted footage to insert her into the film, which must have been a clunky process, and slightly more respectable than what they did with her CGI face in Rogue One. May the most iconic space princess continue to rest in peace. Meanwhile, Luke is also sidelined massively compared to the last film, whilst also retconning his character from The Last Jedi. Like, what is consistency in this film? What is consistency in this finale? Probably the most topical change to this film is, as mentioned before, Rey being revealed to be related to Palpatine. First of all, Palpatine had a kid. This wrinkly, old, maniacal phone charger had a kid. But that's still really stretching the logic there. I mean, Jedi aren't allowed to fall in love, get married or have children. I imagine the Sith aren't too different. Secondly, do you remember my argument in the last episode about Luke being related to Darth Vader was never the sole reason why he could access the Force? Rey was hitting remarkably similar notes for me in this trilogy up until this point. I mean, we discover at the end of The Last Jedi that her parents were nobodies, giving the same kind of message that you don't need a special bloodline to be talented in the Force. Now, because I'm guessing people complained about her not being related to anyone with Force powers, they retcon her as a Palpatine. And while it could explain why the Force called out to specifically her from Anakin's lightsaber in The Force Awakens, and her sudden strength in both the light and dark side in the Force in The Last Jedi, it throws away the concept of Rey being a nobody hero. It's no longer her actions and her desire to save the galaxy that make her powerful, but it's now her blood. All of these problems are made even more present by the fact that this film isn't entirely bad. There are glimmers of a fantastic film in here, and I do see on occasion what they're going for. The visuals, while not as polished as The Last Jedi, are still a joy to look at. The Force Connection lightsaber battle between Rey and Kylo as they fight each other from different locations is so creative and fun to watch. Their later fight on the crashed remains of the Death Star Mark II, while it fizzles out towards the end, is still great to see. The sight of what looks to be endless amount of Star Destroyers against the dark sky only coming into view via shrieking lightning is so cool and menacing to see. The short scene at the start of the film where Poe, Finn and Chewie lightspeed jump from one world to another trying to outrun the First Order is awesome. And Ian McDiarmid as the Emperor is always a joy to watch, even if his presence feels very last minute. He's even responsible for the best scene in the whole film, which is when he's knocked out Rey and Kylo and strikes the entire Resistance fighters with a huge blast of bass-boosted lightning.
Do not fear their feeble attack, my faithful. Nothing will stop the return of the Sith!
My systems are failing! Does anyone copy?
I actually remember seeing that bit in cinemas and saying, whoa, as the bass shook the entire room. I see scenes like that and I think you're so close to being a great film, keep trying. But ultimately, it wasn't meant to be. There's not much else to say about this film, to be honest. Again, this film just feels like it exists with many highs and many lows. It's not a boring disaster like Attack of the Clones, that's for sure, and it's not a so bad it's ironically enjoyable mess like The Phantom Menace, but still not as good as the last two sequels, and especially far from being as good as the original trilogy. Which, after a streak of flawed but enjoyable films with The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, I think it's the weakest bookend to a trilogy. Like, Return of the Jedi, while it had the pointless drawn-out beginning, made up for it as soon as they left Jabba's palace, giving us a well-earned finale to the original trilogy, stopping in just the right place as a conclusion to the characters' stories. Revenge of the Sith, despite only being the better of the prequels because the last 2 episodes were bad, and still having the political talks, still had the incredible opening and a flawed but overall solid third act, which made for a good ending. Rise of Skywalker only managed to stick a perfectly average landing. What's sad about this is that I really didn't want to end up feeling this way about this film. Back when I first saw it in the cinema, I thought this film was amazing. When I started seeing people hating on this film to a point where people in the cinema had to be escorted out of the cinema by security for ranting so much, I didn't want to end up thinking like that. Then I sat down and watched it for a second time for this podcast, and while I didn't despise it, I now see the things that I didn't notice before. And even then, as I'm a casual, I don't really see the damage that this does to the ending of not just the sequels, but the Skywalker saga in its entirety. Rise of Skywalker is a far from horrible and far from great film that I don't see myself returning to for a while. To bring up the actors and music before I conclude this, they all do a very good job. The returning legends Mark Hamill as Luke, Harrison Ford as Han Solo, the late Carrie Fisher as Leia, the late Peter Mayhew as Chewbacca, and Anthony Daniels as C-3PO are as good as ever in spite of getting older. With the new characters, Daisy Ridley as Rey, John Boyega as Finn, Oscar Isaac as Poe, Kelly Marie Tran as Rose, Domhnall Gleeson as General Hux, Andy Serkis as Snoke, and Adam Driver as Kylo Ren / Ben Solo are all great additions to the Star Wars universe, even if their characters don't really come full circle towards the end of the trilogy. John Williams' music is also as fantastic as it's ever been. In fact, I can say with confidence that John Williams is probably the most consistently good thing about the Star Wars films. As I conclude the sequels, I have to clarify this. Neither these films nor the prequels were as good as the original films. Even my love for The Last Jedi was only as strong as my enjoyment of Empire Strikes Back, which was my least favourite of the originals. I'm not entirely sure which is the bigger disappointment, the prequels for overall failing to make engaging stories from pre-hinted legend, or the sequels for, while being technical marvels, overall didn't surpass their preceding films and can only really be looked at as moneymakers for the monopoly empire that is Disney. No matter which is the bigger disappointment, I'll still personally prefer the sequels, simply from the fact that I enjoyed 2 of the 3 films compared to only enjoying 1 of the 3 prequels, and even then, some of that enjoyment was by default. This has been an interesting and very enjoyable journey throughout this discussion. As someone who 5 years ago never properly knew about the films from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, only to be where I'm at now talking in depth about them on a podcast, this has been fun. They've had their ups and they've had their downs, without a doubt, but I understand what made fans fall in love with the franchise to begin with. Even if I didn't like The Rise of Skywalker that much, and The Phantom Menace I only get ironic enjoyment out of, and Attack of the Clones really didn't entertain me, the rest of the films I think are strong examples of the sci-fi genre that, while their type of audience is specific, still holds a large fan base for a good reason. The fans might be questionably aggressive and loud on occasion, but that's only because you care so much about the series, while at the same time being able to accept some of the bad moments, but also having a hearty laugh poking fun at it. Robot Chicken is a prime example of that area. And that is where I'm going to be leaving the Star Wars discussion for now. I know that there's the Star Wars story films, Rogue One and Solo to talk about, as well as the Clone Wars, Rebels and The Mandalorian, but quite frankly guys, I am exhausted of Star Wars. Oh, also if you remember, I put up a poll on Escaping Through the Lens's Instagram asking if you wanted me to dedicate a future episode to discussing how I would have written the prequels. The results came through and it was a tie, so I asked my friends to be the tiebreakers and their overall vote was no. Unfortunately for them, I planned on doing this anyway since the tiebreaker meant that just as many people wanted me to do the idea, I just wanted to be a troll to them. But again, that episode won't be for a long time because I need my show to be about other things than Star Wars. So now, it's your turn. Next week marks the first episode to consist of me discussing films entirely of your choosing. Have your say by following Escaping Through the Lens on Instagram and sending your film requests via the Instagram story. Be quick though, because that story will only be taking in requests for 24 hours, and by 5 PM tomorrow, Saturday the 12th of December, the requests option will close, and any more requests afterwards will not be counted. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the Star Wars discussion as much as I did, and I look forward to hearing your requests. This has been Luke Carruthers recording for Escaping Through the Lens, and I'll see you next week. May the Force be with you.